Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Mike Horowitz, who Fujitsu have asked to speak to you today on the subject of the future of the human in a world of AI. Mike's a leading global expert on AI, on national security, on global politics, on forecasting. I could go on. I'll spare his blushes. Mike's director of Perry Worldhouse, one of the world's leading interdisciplinary research centres. Last year, when we were running the integrated review in number 10, and I was asked to put forward names of external experts who I thought would drive forward innovative thinking on national security, Mike was, without question, the first name on the team sheet. And when we came to addressing AI, creativity, and the future role of AI and national security, again, he was the first name on the team sheet for our speaker program here at DSEI. I feel like that recommendation was endorsed earlier this year. Mike was appointed to be the Fellow in Defence and Security for the Council on Foreign Relations, an extremely prestigious appointment in the US, and I hope a full endorsement of his capabilities. They need no further introduction. Mike's remarks will speak for themselves, I'm certain. I'll be back with you for questions and answers. Please hold those to the end if you can. And yeah, I look forward to picking up the discussion with Mike and all of you in a few minutes. Thank you. Over to you, Mike.
My name is Michael Horowitz. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm really excited to be talking to you today about the role of the human in the world of AI, the future of international security. I'm just sorry that I can't be there in person to deliver this presentation, but due to the ongoing global pandemic, I was unable to travel. And to start, I want to give you an overview of my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of military power today. I'm then going to shift into discussing what is artificial intelligence, this thing that we all care a lot about and think will be really important when we imagine what the future of global power looks like. I'll then discuss how I think of artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology and why that's important for thinking about the international security environment. I'll go into a discussion of the role of trust and confidence in the way the human interacts with artificial intelligence. I'll go into questions that we need to answer when thinking about the role of the human when it comes to AI, and then I'll discuss what I think the future of power might actually look like. So to get us going, let me give you my bottom line up front, which is that great power competitors and non-state actors think about AI and robotics as technologies with the potential to disrupt the balance of economic and military power. As an American, from an American perspective, from a Western perspective, countries like China and Russia think about algorithms, think about machine learning, think about robotics as mechanisms that they can invest in to disrupt the military and economic power of the West. And something that's really challenging here is that advances in AI raise really important questions, practical questions, ethical questions, et cetera, about the role of the human in the international security environment. What are we going to be best at, essentially? And how should that shape international politics? And what I hope you leave here with is an understanding of the way that the decisions that we make will shape not just what algorithms look like, the data that they have, how they're coded, how they're trained, but how we deploy them and to what ends. So the key question I'm going to be talking about is what's the role of the human? How will the role of the human change in the world of AI? And what will it mean for global power? And to do that, I think we need to understand a little bit about how power works today. Here is a chart that shows the spread or proliferation of precision strike capabilities around the world over the last 40 some odd years. This is from ongoing academic research that I'm doing, and it shows the way that the United States has been in the lead for decades in precision strike, but how the rest of the world is beginning to catch up. This next chart shows something you could imagine as a bridge technology between the world that we've been used to and the AI world we're moving towards. And that's the proliferation of armed drones. Systems like the MQ-9 Reaper, developed by General Atomics in the United States. Lots of other countries have these systems. And one of the things that's been really striking in the last decade is and that this chart shows is the way the entrance of China into the export market and then Turkey has fundamentally reshaped global proliferation in this really critical technology that I think about as a bridge between the capabilities of the past and the capabilities that we're thinking about for the future. So what do I mean when I talk about artificial intelligence in this context? If you look at 100 different artificial intelligence textbooks, you'll get 100 different definitions. And what I mean in this context is computers doing tasks that we used to think required human intelligence. Now, to some extent, this is a moving target in that every time a computer can do something, whether it's play checkers, play chess, play Go, play sophisticated video games that I'm not very good at, we imagine that as programming rather than intelligence. And that we're consistently redefining essentially what intelligence means to be what we can do and what a computer can't do. So we need to be wary of that in the context of thinking about AI. But you can imagine algorithms, and here when I talk about AI, I'm really talking about machine learning and deep learning approaches rather than the sort of expert system approaches from the 80s and 90s, although those are certainly relevant as well. But you can imagine algorithms as things that can direct physical objects, process data, that'll be really good, probably better than a human at overall information management, but maybe not so much at decision-making. The things that AI is not. AI is not a gun. AI is not a plane. It's not a widget, which means in some ways it makes sense to think about AI as much broader than a specific military technology. And for those in the defense and security world, this is really challenging because when we think about breakthrough technologies, we tend to think about nuclear weapons, about stealth, about aircraft carriers, about specific technologies that can do a particular task. AI is much different. It's much broader, and that will really impact what it means for us and what it means for the world. And innovation in robotics and AI is not being driven by the defense sector. Think about DeepMind, OpenAI. We have here Baxter, the manufacturing robot, the Roomba. All of these are commercial companies. They're not big defense contractors. I mean, there's controversy surrounding Google's role here, but they're not big defense contractors. They're not making most of their money from the defense sector. Advances in AI are being driven by the commercial sector. This is the opposite of the model from the Cold War, where defense investments then drove advances in the commercial sector. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of the thinkers behind these companies and a lot of these companies themselves got their start with defense dollars. I mean, that's the story of Silicon Valley in the United States in a way. But at this point, these companies don't primarily, the companies pushing the envelope in AI don't primarily make their money in the defense sector and are not primarily designing algorithms for the defense sector. And that's a very different model for thinking about technological change and innovation than when we think about nuclear weapons, stealth technology, or tanks. So I think that when we imagine AI, we need to think about it as a general purpose technology. And a general purpose technology, it's a term that comes from economics that refer to technology umbrellas with broad applications across many areas of the world. Historical examples include the combustion engine, electricity, and computing. And general purpose technologies have substantial impacts on global power, but in both direct and indirect ways and over time frames. And here's what I mean by that. So imagine a technological change, the birth of a general purpose technology, something like electricity, say, something like the combustion engine. You have short-term effects on military power. Say, hey, now we can drive a car onto the battlefield. Now we can invent a tank, those sorts of things. But general purpose technologies also tend to introduce massive social and political disruption and shifts in economic capabilities, which mean that the effect on the balance of power from a general purpose technology is not just about the short-term military impact, the short-term, all right, we can take an algorithm, we can plug it in here, and that this will change the way a military operates. It's about that feedback whereby social and economic and political disruption, as well as economic change, then influence the capacity of countries to invest in their militaries, how they view their interests, and even the way they should think about shaping their militaries. And now you can imagine a three-stage cycle. I want to introduce you to a three-stage cycle that I think helps us start to get at the way that the role of the human will shift in the world of AI. We can start with the traditional technology hype cycle. So, we have the Gartner hype cycle here, where you have expectations on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. You have an innovation trigger, the peak of inflated expectations, the trial of disillusionment, enlightenment, the plateau of productivity, all that good stuff that everyone's familiar with. And in many ways, for the last decade in AI, we've had some inflated expectations. And part of that's because of a failure to differentiate between what I would call a narrow AI, or algorithms designed to do very specific tasks, and artificial general intelligence, or the dream of an algorithm that can then program other algorithms and make broad decisions with minimal input. We already live in a world of narrow AI. Think about everybody looking at their phone right now. Just think about what's delivering ads to you. How is that working? AI is in a lot of the technologies that we already use today, and we're fine with that, whether we realize it's AI or not. Whereas machine learning researchers, as survey research that I've done, that other people have done, shows, actually have a lot of disagreements about the way, the timeframes in which something like artificial and general intelligence might happen, and honestly, even whether it might happen at all. Though there's a sense that a transformational AI might be possible. So stage one of the three-stage cycle I want to take you through here involves technology hype, which is sort of where we've been, although I think we're coming off of it. Second stage is what I would call the trust gap stage. The trust gap stage can be captured by literature on algorithm aversion. And we see here the inability to trust machines to do the work of people, unwillingness to deploy or properly use systems driven by algorithms. You're like, that's not as good as people. Imagine people that refused to use Google Maps at the outset because they thought that Google Maps would never know the secret shortcut that they took to get to work. And spoiler alert, it did. An example from research by McDonald and Schneider is the way that tactical ground air controllers prefer having a pilot physically in the sky to a drone when it comes to close air support, even in apples to apples comparison situations. So that's the second stage, this trust gap stage. The third stage is overconfidence. And this is captured by research on automation bias. And you can imagine automation bias or overconfidence in this context as the delegation of cognitive judgment to a machine and trusting it too much. And the failure to question an algorithm if it makes mistakes, or the failure to realize an algorithm has made mistakes. We've seen this to deadly consequence in the civilian world with things like the Air France crash, in the military world with the Patriot missile fratricide at the outset of the US-led invasion of Iraq. And this kind of overconfidence can lead to risky bets on technology and uses of technology. And we put this all together in this chart here. So the solid line here is the perceived effectiveness of a system. The dotted line is the actual effectiveness of the system. And on the horizontal axis, we have the time since the system was introduced. And the key thing here is that the actual effectiveness of the technology is in some ways less important than how we think about the technology and the choices we make about how to use it and how to deploy it. And you can see that when perceived effectiveness is higher than actual effectiveness at the outset of a system, that's your tech hype cycle. Then as technology improves, as maybe algorithms in a particular area become more reliable, that's when you enter the trust gap phase. When people, don't think that Google Maps can, properly direct them for how to get from home to the office or vice versa. But a big challenge comes on the other end when this reverses as well. When essentially people take probabilistic outputs from algorithms and treat them as if they're a calculator. That's overconfidence. That's the automation bias that we want to hedge against. And a really key question, and again, these are questions that are about humans. A key question when it comes to humans is, how is it that we vector to the sweet spots? Since if you would imagine when it comes to human uses of algorithms that are going to exceed human performance in many areas, but also have clear limitations, and not be perfect, then what we want is a little bit of a trust gap, but a lot of confidence in how the system would work. So what should education and training then look like becomes a critical question in the corporate world, in the academic world, in the government world, when it comes to imagining how to properly integrate advances in machine learning with human cognition in imagining appropriate decision-making moving forward. A thing that makes this really complicated in the international security environment is that everyone is interested in AI and robotics, but for their own reasons. In different kind of political regimes, imagine the role of the human in AI differently. In Western democracies, we tend to think about the role of AI as improving human performance. We have highly trained, highly capable soldiers, operators, civilian elites, and believe that the role of the algorithm is to make people better at what they were doing and to remove drudgery, remove tasks that maybe a calculator can do. So we think about algorithms not as replacing people, but as improving their performance. And that's driven in some ways, in the military sense, by casualty aversion. And the way that substituting robotics, and thinking here now about autonomous systems for people, could take people off the battlefield in a way that puts them at lower risk. But that's not necessarily how potential adversaries with different politics think about the role of AI. There's an autocratic logic to AI that imagines the role of the human very differently. Countries like China and Russia, if you look at what they're writing about AI, imagine algorithms as a way to eliminate the role of the human in lots of uses of force. These governments don't trust their people anyway. If they trusted their people, they'd have a different kind of political regime. So when they think about uses of AI, they think about substituting algorithms for humans that aren't all that reliable, which means they're a lot more likely potentially to cut humans out of the loop and skinny down decision-making to just favor sort of their elites. What it means is that autocratic leaders could potentially control a lot more military force without having to rely on humans that they view as potentially unreliable. This is not just an international security problem, but a domestic politics issue as well. One of the key checks, for example, on government repression around the world for hundreds of thousands of years has been that autocratic leaders need people to carry out their orders to repress their population. In a more dystopian version of an AI future, autocratic leaders might need a lot fewer people to be able to execute widespread surveillance and repression. And that's potentially pretty dangerous. And that's one reason why these advances in AI are so critical when we think about international security, and why the role of the human then becomes important. It's not just about the technology in and of itself, it's about the choices we make surrounding how to use this technology. And there's no place we see this better than in the context of ongoing US-China competition when it comes to artificial intelligence. The US and China are both gunning for AI leadership. And you could imagine that defined in a number of different ways as leadership in AI research, as leadership in military applications of AI. And in many ways, China is investing more from a quantitative perspective than the United States, than the West. What that will mean in terms of quality is still unclear. But this is one reason why there have been a lot of proposals recently about the need for more democratic societies to band together, to work together, to share data, to share knowledge, to share best practices when it comes to how they think about AI as a way of competing with the dramatic resources and people and data that China is bringing to the table in its attempt to generate global AI leadership. One thing I think it's important to mention here before I go any further is that when we talk about international competition in AI, I think it's important that we not talk about this as an arms race. Why is that? I mean, that term's popular, it's out there, et cetera. The reason goes back to this notion of AI as a general purpose technology. Arms races tend to refer to very specific technologies where governments are buying very particular widgets to try to outcompete their neighbors, outcompete their competitors, et cetera. Classic example is the dreadnought race between the British Navy and the German Navy prior to World War I. So arms races tend to be about very specific technologies. Whereas general purpose technologies, the notion of an arms race doesn't even make sense. You could have an arms race in a specific application of AI, but not in AI, and not in AI itself, which is the reason why I think international competition is a better framework to use here. I now want to shift to what I view as key questions that humans need to answer when it comes to our AI future. And I want to talk about three. The first is this question of safety. When we imagine the design and deployment of algorithms, is the degree of safety and reliability that we want a little less than what we were getting out of a human-driven system in the past, the same as what we were getting out of a human-driven system in the past, or better than what we wanted out of a human-driven system in the past? This may depend on the type of application. If we're talking about something involving the use of lethal force, maybe we want our test and evaluation data to be even better than we would demand if it was not an AI-enabled system. If we're talking about a ad targeting algorithm, maybe that's a little bit less important. But one thing that we do know is that AI ML researchers, to the extent that they'll get a vote in this, want the world to emphasize AI safety more. The figure here is from a recent paper that colleagues and I published in the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research that shows that a huge percentage of AI researchers, something on the order of 75%, want there to be greater emphasis placed, either more or much more on AI safety. And then another 20-something% want it to be about the same, less than 10% of AI ML researchers want us to be thinking about safety less. And that shows something really important when imagining what areas of emphasis should look like in AI moving forward. That's the first question that I think it's really important for humans to answer when we think about AI. Second question involves ethics. What are the ethical obligations of humans when it comes to using lethal force? And even going beyond lethal force, I mean, that's the one that makes the headlines. But what are the obligations that we have to ourselves? And how does substituting algorithmic judgment for human judgment affect that? And again, different political regimes may answer these questions differently. In the West, where we tend to think about the role of algorithms as improving human performance, we almost always want a human either in the loop or on the loop. On the loop meaning monitoring an algorithm, even if it's not intervening. Other countries might think about this very differently and think that those ethical obligations don't actually require human engagement when it comes to the use of force. But again, it's not just a use of force questions. Think about the use of an algorithm to aid, say, with promotions, whether at a company or in a military. Companies have experimented with using algorithms for hiring and promotion, and it turns out they have a number of different biases built into them that have to do with the training data. For example, if the data that an algorithm is trained on had gender bias, racial bias, other sorts of biases built into them, then a well-trained algorithm based on that data, well here meaning, effectively trained algorithm based on that biased data is going to produce a biased output. And will seek to just reinforce those biases in hiring and promotion, which in some ways means that what we need out of algorithms, and this affects both the data used to train them and how they're coded, what we need out of algorithms is in some ways better than what we need out of humans, but the only people that can require that are humans. That we need to be better when it comes to the data we use, the code that we write, and the way that we think about training algorithms. Third question is I think really a military one, an international security one, which is how should Western countries respond if removing humans from the loop leads to more effective uses of military force? And this is a big one. As I've just been saying, our approach to thinking about the role of AI in international security is predicated on the idea that algorithms will make our people more effective when it comes to the use of military force. But what if that's wrong? What if it's actually more effective to take the human out of the loop when it comes to the use of military force? I'm not saying we're there. We're nowhere near there, frankly. We've a hard enough time using algorithms for really basic, logistical issues, military surveillance issues, other sorts of things, and to say nothing of the use of force. But essentially, what if the bet that the West has been making about the interaction between algorithms and humans is incorrect? One, how would we know? And two, what would we do? And this, I think, is a huge question that we really need to be thinking about in the months, years, and decades ahead, rather than sort of just discovering this on the battlefield someday. This is something that we need to be thinking about now, and that should be affecting the way that we imagine the world and what the interaction is between international security experts and AI and ML experts. This is why I say in my own country, the United States, we think about the relationship between Silicon Valley and the Defense Department is so important. That's part of where you get the information of whether the bet that you're making is right. Whether this notion of AI is enhancing the human rather than replacing the human is the correct one from an international security perspective. And it could be in other areas, or regardless. But I think this is going to be a really important question in the years ahead. Now, I want to shift into the last part of my presentation and talk about what I think are two different pathways that are going to drive our AI future and affect the way that AI impacts the balance of power and international conflict. And the first is something that we are, I think, relatively familiar with now when we think about AI. After all, I've just been talking about AI as a general purpose technology. A narrower version of that is thinking about various applications of AI as dual use technologies with both commercial and military applications. An example of this would be an image recognition algorithm. Whether you're trying to identify a cat or a tank, and you're talking about the same underlying sorts of principles, you just train it on different data. For dual use applications of AI and robotics, you have commercial incentives for technological invention. And those commercial incentives mean that companies around the world should have interest in developing these sorts of capabilities, which means you'll have multilateral competition in something like image recognition, more rapid diffusion or proliferation of image recognition algorithms, which means, going back to an economic perspective or military perspective, that first mover advantages from these capabilities should be relatively limited, and that fast followers could plausibly catch up. You don't need to be first in one of these areas because you have the opportunity to catch up. But there's another option here, another possibility, one that we spent a lot less time thinking about up to this point. And that is, look, there's no technology, probably, I hope not. It's going to be like stealth. And by that, what I mean is that stealth is something that only governments, or Bond villains, want. It has no real commercial application. It's an exclusively military technology that's had dramatic effects on the battlefield. We imagine, nearly every other sorts of technology we think about, we imagine is like a little more dual use than that. But what if there are some applications of AI? They're not going to be stealth, but that are more like stealth than they are like most algorithms. An example might be, say, a GANs-trained battle management algorithm attempting to make sense of a complicated, multidimensional battlefield, working with a human commander to direct human and machine assets. there's not necessarily a great commercial analog for this kind of system, in part because this would need to be trained almost on speculative data. Given that the nature of war reflects human frailty and reflects fog and friction. No two battlefields are exactly the same. Any battle management algorithm that's trained is not going to be trained on data that's going to be 100% correct for that sort of conflict, which means we're talking about something pretty advanced here. And that might only be relevant to militaries. And if we're talking about our algorithms only relevant to militaries, then commercial spillovers might exist, but not necessarily. And these are the cases where AI leadership, or something like that US-China competition for AI leadership, might actually play a role in determining who gets to some of these applications first, because the ability of lots of different companies to invent these kinds of systems will be lower, which means you have less rapid diffusion and proliferation. So the first mover advantages will be larger. It's more plausible then to lock in advantages if you gain a lead in these kinds of capabilities. The problem is that while we know that a lot of applications of AI are going to fit into that dual use category, we don't know how many will fit into that more military exclusive sort of AI or robotics category. And it's important to recognize in this context that military superiority is not a Western birthright. We have plenty of examples in the past, from the way that the longbow displaced the knight, to the way that carrier aviation displaced the battleship. And we know that this can happen, that new operational concepts, new approaches by humans to how to fight, new capabilities, if you bring those all together, it can change the character of warfare. The risk then would be if today's military leaders rest on their laurels, just invest in what they've been doing before and making it incrementally better. That could then make the capabilities that look like the most important capabilities of today actually be then the thing that's disrupted in a future conflict, which means the opposite of what we should be doing is resting on our laurels. Instead, countries need to be thinking really seriously about the way that advances in AI, in quantum, and other emerging technologies are going to reshape the international security environment and what that means for militaries. So to wrap up, I think that history suggests that organizational politics in many ways will heavily impact the way that technological change, and in this case, think about AI-enabled change, will impact the balance of power. It's not about the technology. It's about the way that people, and then people aggregated in organizations, make choices about how to use technology. And the adoption challenges surrounding AI could vary a lot depending on the kind of algorithm that you're talking about. And whether you're talking about something like image recognition, which has broad commercial applications, or something like battle management, which may not. And then finally, we need to understand the normative question. What should the role of the human be? And then the practical question. What will the role of the human be? And how should we imagine that as changing when we get more information about the battlefield? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to give this presentation. I hope that it's been helpful, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Thanks, Mike. Fabulous, as I knew it would be. Before I hand over to the audience to ask questions, I might abuse the privilege of being chair, and ask you one myself. I love what you did with the Gartner hype cycle. I think it's really interesting. I think it summarizes a lot of the research in a way that I've not seen done so coherently before. But the question it left with me is twofold. One is, where do you think we are on the algorithm aversion versus overconfidence part of the cycle, vice necessarily the hype of the cycle? And secondarily, whether you think there's a significant difference or any difference between different sectors, principally those in the military and those in the private sector, on that hype, trust, aversion cycle. So hopefully that's a reasonable one to kick us off, and we can start the dialogue, and then I'll give you all a chance to ask questions.
Well, that's a great question, Keith. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Awesome. And hey everybody, I think that it sort of depends on who the we is in that. So like take the American military. I think that there's a pretty big gap at the moment between, say, senior leader statements about AI, which reflect a lot of interest, enthusiasm, recognition of importance, and then investments on the ground, which have had, I think there were challenges in moving from S&T and like applied R&D, like across the valley of death into production for AI enabled, for AI enabled concepts. So from a hype cycle perspective, I would say there's a lot of hype and excitement, but you have I think you do have some aversion, from an American context when it comes to all right, what does integration actually look like, and and how will that and how will that function? So who exactly we're talking about essentially, I think affects where we are in that. And I mean, I would add that I think in that context, I think one of the challenges is, and we can maybe get into this if people are interested, the sort of training and education that you need to hedge against some of the getting way too excited once things start coming online. So I'd say there's a lot of hype in senior leaders, and for good reason, and then but some aversion as you sort of move into the heart of the defense enterprise. I think that private companies, for very good reason, are a little bit further ahead, and it's also a little bit easier for them to get to the sweet spots. I mean, one of the challenges of designing military systems relative to designing systems for designing ads or something for a website is that if you want to test your algorithm and how it will work for delivering ads to consumers, you can do A/B testing all the time and eventually vector in and understand, even if your algorithm is black boxed, you at least understand how it functions, when it functions, when it will break, those sorts of things. That can be a lot tougher if what we're talking about is an AI-enabled autonomous system that you're seeking to deploy in a battlefield environment. When exactly will it break? When would an accident happen? How exactly, how precisely brittle it is. That can be hard to know, perfectly ahead of time. And so in that, I think then generates some of those automation bias risks, especially, if we can make it to the point where some of these systems are really deployed. So I think it's easier for commercial companies then to do what I'm suggesting, because they have so much more data and so much more direct experience with using algorithms, out there in the world to support their business.
Makes sense. Great answer. Listen, I want to keep going asking you questions, but that would be a complete abuse of privilege. So if I turn to the audience, has anybody got anything that you'd like to pass to Mike? Otherwise, I shall seize this privilege back and keep going. Yeah, please. Can you say who you are as you ask your question as well? And I'm going to repeat the question for the benefit of those on the video. So, Mike, to repeat that for you and all those who are watching via the video link, Tony's question is, do you think, and correct me if I get this wrong, Chinese whispers, but do you think that we are, in defense, already locked into kind of iterative, vice disruptive or transformative innovation, partly because we tend to see algorithms as a backup rather than as an alternative to humans, as something that would augment rather than replace, and partly because of the nature of our procurement systems, I guess long cycles and naturally being iterative and long-lived. Is that a reasonable summary? I'm getting a nod, so I think I got the question right. Mike, over to you.
I mean, it's a great question. In some ways, it's much broader than AI. It's basically asking whether disruptive innovation is possible given the organizational factors that constrain our ability to procure systems. I mean, and I would, I don't know, I put it in two categories. One is I think that we are not necessarily locked into incremental change when it comes to operational concepts, since that's an area where you could take existing force structure, and if you look at, say, in the US, some of the things the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab is doing and looking at emerging technologies, you can take existing force structure and experiment in novel ways. I think and I can speak more to the American system, here than anything else. I mean, I do think that without a pretty substantial shift in how the U.S. defense procures, it's hard to be transformational across the timelines we think are necessary to take it to be on the cutting edge of technology. Now, it might be that you don't want to be on the cutting edge of technology because the reliability standards that you want are so high that you're never going to quite be there. But I do think we have a challenge when it comes to, if you imagine, say, what it would take, like suppose that tech was there to, say, transform the U.S. Air Force away from having a smaller number of exquisite high quality fighter jets to like the dream of the swarm or something. I'm not saying that's like tomorrow. I'm saying imagine that was possible. How would we actually transform the Air Force in that case, and how long would it take? Even if the tech was ready today, you're talking decades before that was ready. And then think about the cost of like canceling contracts that were already signed for like varieties of F-35 buys, like those kinds of things. There's a lot baked into the system that I do think makes innovation challenging. It doesn't make it impossible, but it does mean that it requires then extra levels of senior level will. And in the American context, it requires, I think, greater cooperation between the executive branch and Congress to facilitate the kinds of changes and requirements and regulations. And then to circle back to the first part of your question, I don't think viewing AI as supporting the warfighter as opposed to replacing the warfighter is necessarily means that innovation has to be incremental, because I think we always actually have a dissertation student working on like a little bit in this area, actually looking at gender and military innovation and the way that the how we define who counts as a warfighter changes throughout history. And I think what we'll do in this context is we'll just change where the warfighter is, once again. Just like the notion of human control changes over time as technology changes from the axe to the spear to the bow and arrow to the bullet, and now to think about the way like LRASM works or something from a missile context. And what's the point of human control in that? It keeps moving back as technology improves. And so I think we'll do the same thing when it comes to AI. Of course, then we won't call it AI, we'll just call it programming.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to seed a question that when I get the 5-minute warning, I'm going to ask you, and then I'll go back to the audience. So I've asked you this question before, but we're post the review now, and I'm genuinely interested in your reflections. When you look at the UK from the US perspective, and you're thinking about these kind of disruptive technologies, my question is going to be, when I get the warning, what do you want from an ally? Like as a US NatSec professional thinking about it from the US perspective, like what is the best way in which that ally can serve and support the US, given that you remain our most critical partner? So we'll come to that later, but I thought I'd seed it so you've got a chance to reflect, and then back to the audience. If you'd like to raise your hands, and I'll try and take questions. Charlie and then Gordon. Okay. Yeah. So, Charlie, I should attempt to repeat it again. Pick me up if I get the translation wrong. So the question Charlie asked you, Mike, was, given the way that autocratic states are employing AI as a potential replacement and a way of advancing their power, whereas Western states perhaps are focusing much more on augmenting, are we already kind of locked in to that cycle, or is there a different approach that could serve what we're calling broadly Western nations in augmentation or replacement?
In some ways, I think that we will be, or at least my hope would be that we'll be a little bit flexible in this regard. And by that, what I mean is, that point that I just made about the way that how we define where human control starts or sort of ends, where the machine takes over, tends to be a function of how confident we are in the performance of a system. Like I'm 100% confident that my calculator is, if we pulled out like an old school calculator, that my calculator is going to be accurate in, doing, basic math or something. And I'm, like 99 point something percent, confident that in a, world where you have full access to, your over horizon, satellite capabilities, that, a Tomahawk missile is going to land, like where you aim it. And then there's the, what level of confidence do you have then in these kinds of systems? And as that level of confidence goes up, you're then more willing to cede more control to the system, which is probably as it should be. I mean, I think one of the big concerns, and I mean this from a human perspective more than from a U.S. national security or UK national security, et cetera, perspective, is that the autocratic, the inherent autocratic interest in, skinnying down the number of people that can possibly knock you out of power means that, say, like the kinds of accidents, the kinds of errors, the kinds of malfunctions that, say, like NGO groups really concerned about military AI integration questions, like that those are actually a lot more likely to happen in more autocratic states who are just going to take more risk when it comes to AI integration, because if they can clear unreliable people out of the kill chain, all the better from an internal use of force perspective and from an external use of force perspective. Whereas I would think in the West that there'd be the opportunity essentially for more flexibility to adapt as technology evolves. Assuming of course that all of our militaries can like get over themselves in their bureaucratic politics, which is far from guaranteed.
Yes, Gordon, I think you were next.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Mike. Gordon Bruce, Fujitsu. It builds on that earlier point of whether militaries can get over themselves. My question, in simple terms, is Boyd's OODA loop irrelevant? Is it a hindrance to our thinking? Is the application of traditional models such as the OODA loop and the human in that loop, frankly, just a unhelpful position? After all, at the very least, it could be an OODA loop, and already you're inside somebody else's OODA loop. So is that more predominant?
So I feel like you projected well enough that I don't need to repeat that, Gordon. But just in case, I think Gordon's question is are we in a position where our operational concepts are holding us back? And with specific reference to Boyd's OODA loop, where perhaps the OODA loop is made obsolete and we could look to more of an OODA loop, as Gordon put it, I guess observe, decide, act. And yeah, to what extent is that concept, and I guess others like it, holding us back rather than helping us with our understanding of future conflict? Mike? Or both, potentially both. Yeah. Mike, you've frozen on our screen, so we don't know if you can hear us, see us, or have the question. Yeah, Gordon, you win the prize for best question at that point. Can I ask our team, have we lost Mike? Okay. Okay. Well, Gordon, great question on which to end, and possibly an imponderable, I suspect. So because I think we're putting this video out, I will still thank Professor Mike Horowitz for what was a fantastic, engaging, exciting, and interesting talk. I might also venture to put words in his mouth and say that when we have asked him the question that I asked previously, Mike said that, and I should say, Professor Mike's students, week in, week out, all seem to be being appointed to the Biden White House. So, like, what he says matters. In the past, Mike's answer has been, and we don't have to put this in if he doesn't agree afterwards, but that what the US wants from the UK is the kind of innovative ally that is willing to push the boundaries in testing and adopting this stuff. A smaller, more nimble force that can prove the kind of concepts, test the kind of questions that Gordon's asking, and drive forward innovation in these technologies in a way that perhaps the larger and therefore arguably necessarily more ponderous US bureaucracy would struggle to do. And I think that's a really interesting provocation on which to end. So, Mike, once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all for listening. I've been asked at the end if we could take the discussion down the escalator and out of this room so they can move on to all the things they need to prepare for later. But thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time.